Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Hello and thanks for downloading Beyond the Balls. Beyond the Balls is a co-production between Women's Sport Australia and Wisp Sports. We are your hosts, Ella Smith and Georgina Mallon, here to discuss all the topics on women's sport off the pitch. Hey Ella, how are you?
Hey Georgina, I'm really good. I'm really excited for today. We have another great guest, of course. How are you? Are you excited?
Yeah, I'm really excited. So we've got Chyloe Kurdas today, so that will be amazing.
Yeah, that's right. Today we welcome Chyloe Kurdas to the show. Shyloe is a passionate advocate for equality and women in sport and was one of the forces behind the development of Australia's national women's professional AFL League, the AFLW. She worked as Victoria's Female Football Development Manager and then as the Director of the AFL's National Female Academy. Before that, Chyloe played for Melbourne University as an elite football player in her own right and was one of the first women to play football on the MCG. She's also worked in AFL commentating and continues to do so. Chyloe is now the National Female Participation Manager for Golf Australia, where she's in charge of enhancing the engagement of women and girls in golf. Chyloe, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Chyloe, you grew up in a Turkish household in Melbourne. What was sport for you growing up and what did it mean to you?
Yeah, I think sport was probably the first thing that gave me a sense of what I was, that I was good in something in my own right. My parents aren't sporty at all. I've never seen my dad run, let alone kick a ball or anything like that. He's very good with his hands and he's spending all of the pandemic and lockdown in Lakes Entrance building amazing things, but he's terrible at sport. So I think sport for me was an opportunity for me to create and craft my own identity within the family household. And it's something that made me feel really good about myself. It gave me, it helped to give me a sense of self-esteem and agency in my body and that I could do things because I was, I was reasonably good. I could do things that other people couldn't as well. And that was kind of fun as a 5-year-old little kid.
Yeah, you were clearly a very sporty child growing up. From when I have read, you did martial arts as well. You mentioned on the Let's Talk podcast with Fraser Orford that it was the place that made you feel good about yourself. What was it exactly about all sports and also AFL specifically that did make you feel good about yourself?
Well, I think like anything, if you're good at something and you're constantly getting, you do get positive feedback and, from your coaches or your instructors or even from yourself, or you want to throw that ball at that target and you actually can. And so there's immediate gratification in that. So yeah, there's a natural reward, intrinsic, so that extrinsic rewarding that goes on. But I think I was a pretty small kid. I still am very small. And so I really struggled a lot with being so little. And I remember when in grade 3, I really struggled with confidence and how small I was. And, I'd run as fast as I can in races at school, but, for my height, I probably did okay, but I really just struggled with a lot of that. And I found my way into karate in the same year. And within 12 months of doing karate, I'd realized that I'd learned, and particularly with karate, it's one of the things I think I really love about it is that you are celebrated on merit, not on size, strength, gender, sexuality, ability, disability, colour, heritage. You get celebrated for the work that you've put in and your belt. That's it, and there's a culture of mutual respect. There is a culture of working hard, but also giving feedback and really challenging yourself. So for me, I was a small little 8-year-old kid, but I realized that I didn't need to be another foot taller to be able to influence and have an impact. And it's not the size; it's actually how smart you are and how you use what you've got. That's going to win you the fight, so to speak. So, karate was probably something that really saved my life in lots of different ways. So there's a lot of stuff that I got from karate as a kid that I still use today, that have made me feel, that have really supported the journey that I've been on.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I wanted to ask about your TED Talk, which is called The Power and Potential of Women's Game. We'll put that on our show notes because it was amazing to watch. You talk about when you were 5 years old, you were already a pretty good AFL player. And you said at that point, when you're 5 years old, you realised your time and place in history meant that I would never get to play the game professionally simply because I was female. That struck me because that is so young to have such a deep realisation. How did that impact you?
Yeah, I think it was kind of it was a weird experience for me because I was the first grandchild for both sides of my both sides of my family. My dad's Turkish, my mum, her background's Australian Hungarian, and we had Catholic Muslim household, very liberal Catholic Muslim household, but yeah, I could see certainly there was gendering that existed, and I didn't really like the things that girls were being streamed into or women were required to do in my household, and I kind of liked a lot of the things that the boys got to do. You got to use your body, and my body, using my body was something that I was good at, and it made me feel good, and so I wanted to be doing those things like working on cars and mowing lawns and the like. So that. But it wasn't just when I was at home, it was when I went to school, and you could see everywhere, like even in primary school and grade prep, there were certain things that boys were encouraged to do and girls weren't. And I could see the language on TV. I could see where girls weren't on TV, and the roles that they kind of played. And it just seemed just so grossly unfair, because I had this thing that, I could play sport really well and I could play footy really well, but you don't want that. And so it just left me with this feeling of being deficient, that being female is to be deficient. And if I'm honest, in the way it impacted my life, it really, the natural femininity that exists within me, and there's quite a lot, the natural femininity that existed within me, I really suppressed that, and I saw that as a weakness. I saw that caring, nurturing, gentle sides of part of myself as something that was quite weak because it was feminine, and I really didn't lean in towards that. I leant in towards those things that are gendered to be masculine, and strength and power and physique and dominance and winning, and those kinds of things were what I aspired to. And I had to, quite a lot later on in my life, I had to then go on a bit of a journey where I had to reclaim my own femininity and really embrace that, because they're beautiful gifts as well, and they're really quite complementary to the other part of myself. But for so long I actually switched off, I guess, half of myself, and probably the more powerful parts of myself, to be honest, that loving, caring piece. I think if anyone asks, I guess, if you ever asked what's your superpower, I would say love now, but there's no way in the world I would have said that as a kid, because I saw that as being weak and feminine. So when we tell girls and women and boys and men that femininity is not aspirational, it's not something to be celebrated, it's something that's perceived as weak and undesirable. What we're saying to 51% of the population is you're undesirable and you're not enough and you're unworthy. But what we're also saying to boys and men, that if some of those things call you, which they do, I know a lot of men that are great lovers and very gentle and caring and nurturing, what they're saying to them is that's something to be ashamed of, and because it emasculates you, and you should try and suppress that as well. So it impacted me in many ways, but that's probably the biggest impact that it's had on my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really interested in your relationship with the idea of, she's so good, she can play like a man. You discussed this in the podcast that I mentioned before, and I find it so interesting how dominant this idea is that a female athlete is deemed exceptional when she exhibits a playing style and the sort of athletic prowess in a masculine way that's similar to male players. And it's particularly in traditional male sports like AFL. And you mentioned before how that's something that you definitely chose to exhibit more so and switched off your, I guess, more feminine side, as you said, as a young player. How did you grapple with that, wanting to be the best that you could, but also the idea that you were only deemed good if you played like a man?
Well, that's right. The boys let me play in primary school on the oval. and they let me play. They'd let me play. It wasn't something that I was automatically included in. It was at the the decisions of the boys in my class, and they let me play because I was good enough. I could play like them, and I wasn't going to hold them back. And I was I was just like one of them. I had met their masculine definitions of success. And there were plenty of my female peers that would have liked the opportunity to come and have a kick at lunchtime occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally. And I distinctly remember those few times that they did try and come down and play on the oval with us. The boys kind of bullied them away. And you could, and then in turn, I would then cop some flack from those girls because I was on the oval with the boys and they weren't. It did create some barriers in division. And but at the same time, if those boys didn't let me play, I don't think I would have gone on to have the career that I've had, because I really cut my teeth there and learned how to kick a ball properly and learn how to play the game and learn how to be pretty physical and learn how to get tackled and be tackled. But I do, if I look back at my life, I've spent my whole life trying to play like the boys in sport so that that I could be accepted and received by them. And I think that's incredibly sad, because what we're saying is, as women, we can't celebrate you for all your inherent beauty and wonder and brilliance. However it comes, there are certain benchmarks you have to hit before we can celebrate you in the way that we would celebrate a man. So everything is, those definitions of success are really masculine. And where does that come from? That idea of sport, even our mixed sex sports, by men, for men, to the needs of men. That's how they've been built. That's our history that we've inherited. And therefore you end up with system structures and cultures within those entities that are very influenced by masculine ways of thinking and masculine people and masculine leadership frameworks and masculine success definitions. So what you end up with is that if you want to be accepted, you have into those environments, you have to speak that language and you have to play to those frameworks. What it means is that there's a lot of women that don't get celebrated for their inherent wonderfulness because they don't necessarily meet those masculine definitions of success, but they're still pretty bloody awesome, and they're awesome in their own right. And so that's part of the reason why I find this comparative. Like there's just such a desire to compare men's and women's sports rather than just enjoy them for what they actually are and celebrate them for what they actually are in their own right.
Yeah, so Shyloe, you played AFL at the highest level possible at the time for Melbourne University. What was it like to be a woman playing footy back then, before it was widely accepted that women were good players?
Yeah, it's funny when you say back then, because it sounds like I was like born 100 years ago. It's hilarious. It's great. Makes me feel really old. What's funny is my first year that I discovered the Victorian Women's Football League was when I was 20. I had a friend that was playing in a club, and I went and watched her pretty much every weekend, but I never played a game. And I was amazed. It was awesome. All these women everywhere. And I was like, I'd never seen anything like it before. It's fantastic. And women of all shapes and sizes and sexualities and colours and alike. And it was great. But I didn't play a game at all that year, even though I really wanted to. And the reason why is that I was waiting for an invitation to be let in. And when you asked me before about what's been some of the impacts of that moment when I'm 5 and I realised that I'm not good enough and you have to wait to be let in by the boys, I'd found this all-female football space, but I still was waiting for the invitation. I was waiting to be let in because I was taught very early on as a girl, even in a women's football environment, you wait your turn, girly, and you make sure, you wait for your invitation. You cannot just come in and take up your rightful place in the world. So I would have liked to have an extra year of games under my belt, but I spent a whole year watching. And I was at a Christmas barbecue later that year that my friend said, hey, why don't you come and play? And I was like, oh, thanks so much. Love to. And if I hadn't have had that invitation, I don't know if I'd be speaking here with you today. So I think when we think about the impacts of some of those things, we've got to think about, what do we need to do as people that are empowered to open doors for others that may not necessarily experience the same level of empowerment for us. So when I first started, it was this whole wonderful new world. It was amazing and so liberating and free, and just like I'd come home, or, it was pretty amazing. I spent a couple of years playing at another club, and then I moved to Melbourne Uni, and that was just, an incredible experience because I think it was 24, I think, when I joined Melbourne Uni, or 23. And they're all a bunch of uni students. The club was set up by a woman who didn't really want to play herself, but she realised that a bunch of her friends wanted to play, Mary Chinaki. And she just said, you know, it's not fair that my friends want to play and they can't. So she set up this club for us to play in. And yeah, 2 years later I came along, and such an early part of the club. So we all were playing, but also running the club as well. So it wasn't like you had, you know, old Jack, who's been around the club for 50 years, who's the club president. Like, we had to be the president, you know, the secretary, and the captains and players, as well as everything else. So it was really wonderful to build something with our hands, you know, literally almost with our hands from the ground up, and then go on a wonderful journey on field, where we rose from being last on the ladder to the most successful club in the competition, prior to Darebin and the juggernaut that Darebin became. You know, we enjoyed amazing success, played in 8 consecutive Division 1 or top level grand finals, and it was a wonderful journey with that group of women, and we did something very special. And if I think about my time off the field as the secretary at the club for a long period of time, that we always would make decisions not just on what's good for us right now, but what are we going to leave behind for those women in 100 years' time? It was always very present in our mind about the legacy we were leaving, and what are we crafting, and what's the space we're crafting for others that come after us. We're very committed as a group of women to leave something behind for others. And it was a pretty wonderful group of people, and a very special time to be walking a very new path that the community hadn't yet seen.
Yeah, so you were one of the first women to play football on the MCG in 2004. What was that moment like?
I was pretty emotional, to be honest. You know, it came about really quickly, and even 6 months earlier, if you had said to me I was going to play on the MCG, it was Mother's Day game 2004, and yeah, if you had said to me that I would have been playing on the G in 6 months' time, it was beyond belief. You know, just the culture of football back then. Just, you know, women not putting women on the hallowed turf, you know, you kind of sacrosanct space. So when the opportunity arose, the AFL wanted to run a women's match, because there'd been a bit of negative publicity, I think, around women's, you know, around women and girls in the AFL, and they'd created a women's round a year or two earlier, I think, and the women's round had historically been around all elements that women engage with the game, all elements of the game that women engage with, except for playing. And it was probably the last piece I hadn't really done much with. So yeah, the AFL had provided this opportunity to the Victorian Women's Football League to play one of its games on the MCG. And it just so happened that weekend it was a grand final rematch between Melbourne University and St Albans. And St Albans, Debbie Lee's club, Debbie Lee obviously at Western Bulldogs now, she was the president of the league at the time, and it really was a no-brainer, because it was going to be a great contest. It always was a really fierce and ferocious game between the two clubs, and you know, it was the grand final rematch, and the same two teams played in the grand final later that year. So it was going to be the best display of women's football for the, you know, handful of people that would have gotten there that early to see us play. And it was a pretty wonderful experience. I remember walking up, and all week, you know, I was very much like, oh, you know, it's just another game of football. It's got to, week by week, got to play, you know, just got to get the win. You know, it's still a regular game of football. It doesn't matter where you play it. And I was very, you know, very methodical and very much compartmentalised it. And we went into the old Southern Stand rooms and walked up the race pre-game, as you do when you go and check out the lay of the ground and the grass and whatever. And I remember just walking up the race, and as I crossed over and stepped onto the grass, I just burst into tears, because I think there was a lot of that, you know, that little 5-year-old girl that has walked alongside me. She was very present in that moment. You know, those moments where she was told, you can't be this thing, and here she was actually doing it. And, you know, even to talk about it now, it's very, very emotional. You know, so there was a bit of a cry on the ground beforehand, and then, you know, we played the game, and it was a pretty wonderful game. We came from behind to win. We got, we're on the big screen, and even that was amazing. We'd never seen ourselves on video like that before. And all of our family and friends came down, and it was just a really wonderful day. And it was just we were very aware that we were taking a step that no other women had taken before, and we were doing something that would change the game yet again, for what women could have in the future.
Yeah, that's incredible. So Shyloe, after university, you worked in teaching and then began at AFL Victoria in 2007 as the female football development manager. This was 10 years before the national AFLW competition launched. Was that always your goal from the outset of beginning work there, or was it always something that became a clear objective throughout your time there?
No, I didn't go in there saying, hey, let's create a national comp. Initially, like in my head, I was like, let's grow these under 18 competitions. And then, it wasn't, I got in there and went, actually, we can do this, but we've got to build, we have to hit benchmarks, and we have to build, small first initial steps to get to achieve that national goal. And I think to be honest, it was always in the back of my head, wouldn't it be great if you could make this happen? But it was just so, once I got in there and I realised what the culture was like and what people thought was possible and probable with the women's game, it wasn't something that I spoke about openly, but it was always something that I was secretly kind of working towards, because if I had been talking about national women's competition from day one, people would have freaked out and been very uncomfortable with that notion. So we had to do things that were comfortable and safe for the management and the culture of the sport at the time, and running competitions and for teenage girls and schoolgirls, that certainly was very comfortable, and growing the experience, the quality of the experience that those girls were having, growing the quality of talent that those girls were able to display, recruiting more and more girls and women into those spaces, and growing up a generation of young women who would go on to become that first cohort of girls and women drafted into the AFL. Those things were safe, but I could never have attached them in the early days to a national women's competition, because I would have just been questioned, why are you doing this? So we made it very much about growing the impact of the AFL, growing the fan base, growing the potential membership base, growing the potential, I guess, family base, when these girls and women grew up and had their own families, and that they would maybe steer their children into football instead of soccer. And because soccer was growing at that time, and there was a big fear that soccer was going to take away the future talent base of the sport for boys, for men. And so there was a very cynical element to engaging in female football, that, well, if we teach the girls how to play football, and we give them a positive affiliation with football, when they're parents themselves and they've got sons, that they would potentially steer their boys. They'd be more likely to steer their boys into the AFL system rather than into the soccer system. So there was a very big fear around that. So I could use that to even get some of the most cynical people over the line as to why we were investing in female football.
Yeah. At what point in your time there did you start to see the momentum grow and the support for a national league grow larger than the opposition or the discomfort with it? And at what point did you notice that did you manage to convince the bigger bosses that they did have something to sell?
It was really late, to be honest. It happened really quickly. Now, while Andrew Demetriou was CEO, that was probably the big thing that helped us, is that Andrew Demetriou left and Gil McLachlan came in. And Andrew Demetriou's leadership, was very much, he played the game at the in the AFLM himself. He was still of that former mindset in the game where, the games, women couldn't possibly play at the highest level, and women, we would encourage to engage women in the game, to be fans and members and supporters of the industry and the sport, but having that leadership shift was pretty critical. Something that was 2015, so it was quite late. And I remember very clearly that Gil came in. He hadn't been in the role very long, and we were at a women in football breakfast, and I clearly remember him saying, "So everyone's saying 2020 for this women's national league, but I reckon we can do it in 2017." And we all took a big sigh, big breath, and went, "Oh my God, Gil, that's 3 years too early." And it was 3 years too early, because systems and structures weren't set up appropriately to be able to absorb or take on, eight women's teams, but they made it happen. They got it going, and sometimes you've just got to do that. You just got to throw it together and make it happen. So credit to Gil for choosing to have that vision. But that's a critical piece, isn't it? Up until then, the senior key decision makers hadn't really bought in. There was a small group of us within the AFL. So someone like myself in every state, the state manager, and then the national female manager, Jan Cooper. And then we were part of game development. And we would meet every year, and we build a national female strategy every year that we work forward on. And then there was a time that, and Jan would report into her boss, and he changed, that man changed. And it was always a man. But that person in that role changed a few times over the years. But we got to a point, I reckon Grant Williams, who's the head of the AFL umpiring division at the moment, Grant Williams, he took on that portfolio, and he was probably the first person to go, you know what if, I reckon we could do this national women's competition. We were talking about it. And he was probably the first person to go, yeah, well, maybe we can. So then he would play, that person in that role would play his role internally and manage up and speak to his bosses. And, okay, well, this thing's coming. And what if we could do this? And we were given, I very clearly remember in 2010, we were given permission to start planning forward to 2020. So we had this 10-year lead up. And so that's what wasn't something that we spoke about widely in the AFL staffing kind of network, but we were able to say to the girls, it's coming 2020 national women's competition, stick at it, stay in the game, we'll get you there. And that was really powerful to have that moment in 2010 where we go, okay, we've got license to say 2020 now. That's really exciting. And the kids will still say, they're not kids anymore, they're amazing young women playing in the AFLW, but they'll say, Shyloe, we still remember your 2020 speech, so that was really powerful. So there's probably two things. If I was going to say two things that made a real impact for us, the ability in 2010 to say 2020 was going to be our target year. So we could start to then say to the girls, bring it to life, and they could almost physically see it in front of them and their families. And then the change of the CEO at the AFL, where the CEO started to think a little bit more differently than leadership we had before about women's engagement in the game. That was pretty powerful.
Yeah, so you had a massive influence on the promotion of the AFLW through the media, and a lot of it stemmed down to your approach to preparing the AFLW players to represent themselves on social media. How did you get your players to build their own platform?
Yeah, well, that actually came, funnily enough, I work in golf now, but it came from an experience I had in 2012. I was sent over to the US by the US State Department on an exchange program that was focused on empowering girls and women through sport. And I got to spend a month working at the Ladies Professional Golf Association, the professional women's tour in the US, and spent a month with them and learning about what they do and what they didn't do. And we had a lot of similarities, actually, even though they're quite different sports, because you're still working in women's sport and you're still having to overcome the general, gender inequality that exists in the community. So one of the innovations that they did was that they put all of their players on Twitter, and they used their caddy bibs. They put the Twitter handles of all of the players on the bibs of the caddy. So if you're watching at home, you could just look up that player on Twitter and start following her and create your own fan base, rather than have to rely on the media, which wouldn't report on you anyway. So you could create your own narrative and your own story. And also they would then coach their players. For every competition, the players went into the locker room, there'd be a one-pager saying, this is the partner, this is their social media handles, here are some suggested posts, here are some suggested words, we'd love you to say this, this and this, maybe take a photo doing this. So they really coach their players on how to use that platform to give kudos to the people that were supporting them, but also how to tell their own story in a way that would be really positive and would represent them in an authentic way. So I came home and I was like, that's a no-brainer for me. The girls were all on Facebook. They had no idea about Twitter. But I taught them how to use Twitter. And what I did, we had an AFL Victoria youth girls, under 18 youth girls account. And I got the girls to create their own content. And what I did is I just retweeted it. So the aim was to do a twit pick a week and then post something, if it might be a state training, a club training, it might be a schoolgirls footy, whatever it might be, but let's make some noise about women's football. And you create the content, and then I would just retweet it. And so we had, and then they started to retweet each other's stuff. And what happened was we created our own kind of noise. in that social space, that we're able to start to permeate spaces that we hadn't traditionally been able to get access to. And we got to tell our story in our own way and control what was said about us because we were saying it. And that was really powerful. So not relying on the media to tell our stories, because they'd always only tell stories of, you know, the mad, bad, sad stories. How many injuries have you had? Is your mum scared of you playing? Does it hurt when you mark the ball in your chest? How many concussions have you had? Just that stupid, disrespectful way of reporting on women's sport. And then, you know, then there started to be a little bit of, from the media, oh, there's a bit going on over here. Can we come and be a part of that? So, and their tune really changed. So it was something that came from golf, an idea that came from golf. And then if I look at the way the girls now, many of the girls now use that platform and how they use that platform, you know, it's incredible that they are strong, empowered women who control what's said about them and how it's said, because they actually lead it themselves. It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, the idea of, you know, using the hashtag to gain control of the story just reminds me of, you know, the Taylor Harris, the famous photo, and how she used the hashtag Kick Like a Girl to actually gain so much momentum and, you know, I guess bring together a group of girls on social media who were such big fans. And I think that's really shows how successful it was. I wanted to ask about, obviously, the first AFLW Premiership game was played in 2017. As you mentioned, it was brought a bit earlier, between Collingwood and Carlton at Icon Park, which had a capacity for 25,000 people. You've said in your TED Talk that the catering company for that game was told to only cater for 10,000 people, and then over 27,000 showed up. And actually, many of the spectators had to sit outside. This was such a significant moment for AFLW and the progression of the women's game. And I want to know, how did you feel in that moment? And also in terms of having been such a big part of it, but not being able to play, what was that feeling like?
Yeah, it was a pretty, again, you know, I think you've picked all the stories that are going to make me cry. Thanks very much for today. Because yeah, it was incredibly emotional. And I'd been out of the AFL. I left in the September the previous year. So I'd been out for a little while, and I'd been over in the US having a holiday. I went over for the Donald Trump inauguration. I did book my ticket before the election, thinking it would be quite different, but I still went to the inauguration anyway. I went to the Women's March the next day, and I'd been in this really kind of hostile, angry space in the US, and it's very unpleasant and scary. And I flew home the day before the first game, and it was a completely different vibe. It was the absolute tonic that I needed, but it was such a contrast between those two. And it was a really beautiful Friday night in Melbourne. The sky was amazing. It was orange and purple and green and pink and yellow, and in where the game was played, Princes Park in the North, Carlton's old home ground. You know, the trams coming home on Friday night from work were just chockers, full of people, and going to the footy, which you haven't seen since that ground was decommissioned as an AFLM Premiership ground, and people were just spilling out. And we went for a drink in Sydney Road and beforehand, and people were spilling out of cafes and restaurants and bars and walking down. They had scarves on in 27-degree weather and bouncing footies, and it was just the most amazing picture. And you hit Princes Park, which is a huge big ground, a huge big open space, and the park was just full of people, families and kids and dogs and parents and grandmas and wheelchairs and, you know, rainbow flags and all sorts of different things. It was just this amazing moment of the community coming together. And like I said, such a contrast from where I've been in the US, where the community was really dismantling and falling apart. And, you know, again, a little bit like, you know, thinking about that game on the MCG where, yep, just got a job to do, got to go and call the game of footy. And, you know, the ABC radio call started, and Al Nicholson, he sort of threw to me and went, "So Shyloe, as Collingwood comes out, how are you feeling?" And in that moment again, yeah, it was quite emotional and cried a little bit. And I was like, yeah, this is actually really powerful. And again, I talk about that 5-year-old little Shyloe that walks alongside me, and she was very present that night in that commentary box with me, and very proud of what we've crafted together. I'm very pleased that other little girls won't know what she had to go through. So it was pretty powerful. And in terms of my own feelings about not ever playing the game at that level, in that experience, you know, you have to make peace with your time and place in history, don't you? You can't change when you're born. So there's no point in feeling sad or jealous or envious or any of that. But what I'm really pleased with is, you know, what I've chosen to do with my time and place in history. You know, there were certain boundaries and barriers for me. But I think what's important is what you choose to do with that, how you choose to act. And that's what leadership is. And that's your legacy, and your leadership legacy will be defined by what you choose to do when there are barriers and boundaries in front of you. Do you just accept it and go home, or do you look for different ways to go over and around it and try and overcome some of those injustices? And so there was, for me, yeah, just an amazing sense of contentment, to be honest, that we'd gotten there, and to see so many of my kids run out and have that experience, that thing that I'd promised them, that if you keep doing this, if you keep turning up, if you keep working hard, if you keep getting better, if you keep telling your story, we're going to build it. It'll come. Don't you worry. They'll have to build it. And that's exactly what happened. So it was really lovely to be able to repay the faith of the girls and say, look, I told you so, and thank you for playing your role. So it was really wonderful for them to have that experience and to go on and lead it now. And, you know, I look at kids like, well, kids, not so much a kid anymore, Alicia Eva, who captain at the Giants, who's going to do amazing things. She'll be probably the first woman to coach within the AFLM system, I'd say, at a really high level. She's just an incredible football brain and so well respected. But there are so many of those girls that will go on and do other things in and around the game, not just play, but they'll be talent ID scouts, they'll be recruiters, they'll be coaches, they'll be administration staff. They'll play a critical leadership role in the game moving forward because they were so instrumental in creating the AFLW simply by turning up and being a part of the structures that we built to get us there in the first place. So I think your leadership is defined by how you lead, and your outcomes will just come from that. And when you invest in the capacity of others rather than invest in yourself, when you invest in the capacity of others so that they can achieve their hopes and dreams and aspirations, that's where your leadership legacy becomes infinite. It creates a ripple effect, and it goes long and well beyond you.
Yeah, and I guess that really just goes to show, you know, people like yourself and all the players and everyone else involved, how it became, you know, a professional league when 10 years ago that was just, you know, barely an idea. And I think that's just so amazing to talk to you about. But we'll move on to golf now. So you finished working for the AFLW in 2016, took a year off, went to the States, and then you started working for Golf Australia as their female engagement senior manager. What a pivot. Was golf always on your radar? Was that something that you'd wanted to get involved in?
Oh, God, no. I never wanted to work in sport again, to be honest. I was exhausted. That's why I left. Because building the AFLW was just so exhausting for those 10 years. But to be honest, like I remember going to a Women in Leadership program when like in 2007, 2008, and they said, don't think about your ideal dream job in the future. Think about the ideal dream traits that you want in a career or in a job in the future. So for me, there were things like leadership roles, something I was passionate about, something that allowed me to change the world, strategy focus, a little bit of travel, and to be reasonably remunerated. They're my 6, really simple. And the job at golf came up, and a recruiter tapped me on the shoulder, and I was like, and then I actually overlaid those things with the role at golf, and I was like, you know what, actually it ticks all of my boxes. And it's a good stretch task for me. It's from a domestic sport to a global sport. What a great opportunity. And then to go from being working in a state-based role in the AFL system to working as a national manager and overseeing, you know, the development of the game at a national level. Great opportunity. So yeah, leapt at it, and I'm so glad I did, because it's such a wonderful place to work. And unlike the culture and system and structure that I had, say, in the AFL system, where it was really challenging getting the senior key decision makers to really buy into elevating the status of women and girls in the sport. Golf, I don't have any of those issues at Golf Australia. Internally, in our administrative structures, everyone's on the same page. Like, we need to make sure that our sport is really strong on gender equality. It doesn't make sense to hold half the population back. It's good for women. You know, it's good for the sport, but it's good for women, and it's good for men too. And we really understand how important gender equality is for creating healthy and well communities. So that's wonderful to work amongst a group. I don't have to, there's no internal battles. So that's really fantastic. Externally, in the broader golf community, it's quite different, say, than in footy. It's probably the opposite. Footy clubs were really supportive for the most part, and really wanted to jump on board female participation. In the golf community, things are a little bit slower because there are so many inherent long-term history and traditional components of golf that, just take time to kind of move and shift culturally. So, but I'm loving the challenge, and I'm meeting some really fantastic people in the sport, both internally and externally in the community golf club world. And, it's really wonderful to walk alongside them on their journey, understanding more about gender equality and the impact they can have on the lives of women and girls and boys and men in their local communities, just simply through encouraging girls and women to play the game. So it's a good stretch task and a good challenge, but I'm loving it. And if I think about how golf has managed its way through the pandemic, been some terrific empowered and empathic leadership at Golf Australia, and I'm incredibly grateful for the leadership and how the organisation has looked after its people, because it's been such a scary and uncertain time that, I think that our executive team, we didn't have a CEO, we had an acting CEO during this time, and they've all done a really terrific job in staff wellbeing and looking after everyone. So I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to work at Golf Australia, and I'm learning so much from the opportunity, and it's a wonderful place where I feel really valued.
Yeah, so golf is obviously a very different sport to AFL, but there are still big gender disparities in terms of prize money, participation, media exposure. What are the issues that you are tackling in this role?
Yeah, I think the thing we're really really focusing in on is cultural change, understanding who we are as a sport, really understanding the layers of the problem around gender inequality inherent within the sport. Women have been able to play the game for 150 odd years. There's not a lot of angst about letting women play on the grass. That's not the pain point. But when they play, how they play, and how much access they get, that's kind of been some of the pain points. And letting women into the boardroom, encouraging and having good gender balance in the boardroom, that's probably another pain point where we're having to do a bit of work. And so the real focus for us right now is trying to create cultural change, so that when we invite women and girls to come in and play the game, that they're met with a culture that reflects who they are. They feel welcome, they feel supported, and the product in golf clubs has been tailored to suit their needs so that they'll stay. If we don't, and there's been a lot of change for women in the last 50 years. The reason why my role's in place is that, in 1970, 34% of community golf club members were female. And today it's just barely 20%. So it's diminished significantly over the last 50 years. But also women's lives have changed over the last 50 years. We've gone to work, we've gotten university educations, we've gotten divorced more. So we're more likely to be single parents. We need to have careers. The economy's changed. We need to have dual incomes in our families. So women don't have a lot of time. There's only a small part of the community. There's a record number of women in the workforce prior to COVID, I should say, 61%. And we've never had rates like that before. So golf being positioned as a weekday women's option really limits it to being a sport for, older women who are retired, or women that are in an economic bracket that most women aren't in. So what we really need to help golf clubs do is reframe, reshift how they offer golf for women and girls, so that it's accessible for all women, not just a small cohort of women who don't work during the week.
Well, it does sound like that's a big challenge that you've got ahead of yourself, but you've proven that you can make a lot of change. So we're really looking forward to seeing where that goes. Shyloe, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it. And this has been just one of the greatest chats we've had on this podcast so far, I think. And as someone who started playing AFL this year, I really appreciate all that you did to, I guess, get the sport out there and push other people like myself to start it. And I really thank you for coming on today.
Oh, no worries at all. Lovely to chat. And congratulations on the podcast and the work you're doing. I think storytelling is a really powerful medium, and there are some wonderful people in the community. And so congrats on getting your podcast going, and take care. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was a great interview. Shyloe is such an inspiring and passionate woman in sport, and we feel so privileged to have been able to have this chat. Head to wisports.com to find the show notes. You can find Chyloe on Twitter at CHLOE14, and we are at Oz Women's Sport on all socials. Wisports is at Wisports on all socials, or if you prefer email over social media, the email is info@wisports.com. Thanks for listening to the show. We've spoken to some amazing women in sport, and we are so grateful for their time. We'll be back in another 2 weeks with another fantastic guest.